Hi, and welcome back to the class. I mentioned that we would be focusing primarily on the law pillar, and so I thought we would start the class by talking about certain legal fundamentals. What is the law? How does it work? And why is it important to business? And so we start with that question that we have touched on before, which is to say, what is the law? How would you explain the law to someone who had no concept of what you were discussing? Well, essentially, the law represents the behavior that a particular community finds acceptable. Now, that community could be a city, it could be a state, it could be a country. In any event, that group of people, that society, that community will find certain behaviors acceptable and others unacceptable. So if you are driving through a state like Texas with a 75 mile per hour speed limit and you cross the line to go into Louisiana and the speed limit drops to 70, what we are seeing is that these two different communities, Texas and Louisiana, have differing ideas about acceptable speed on the highway. So the law represents the behavior that a community finds acceptable. Now, there's another aspect to the law, which is to say the law also provides sanctions for those whose behavior is unacceptable, meaning the law has remedies built into it to sanction that behavior that falls outside of that scope of acceptable behavior. So in this lecture, we're going to examine the law and talk about how it operates in society, and especially in the business sense. So what is the law? The law provides a framework for society. Have you ever seen a house being built from the ground up? If you have, you will notice that first the foundation is poured, and then they start with the framing. Now, the framing is just plain old 2x4s, lumber, raw lumber that is put up and that will eventually be covered up on both the outside and the inside. But nevertheless, the framework is the structure which holds the house up, even though you cannot see it. It's not the brick or stone on the outside that's holding the house up. It is those 2x4s that are not visible to the eye. So in a similar sense, law is the structure on which society hangs. The law provides stability, predictability, and continuity so that people can be sure how to order their affairs. Now, every law has two aspects to it. There are two elements in every law. The first is the rule. Do this or don't do that. There's a rule. And that rule is essentially a right. You have a right to cross the street without someone running into you. That is the law grants a right, which is the rule. The law also includes this other aspect, what we call the remedy. And in this case, it is the means to enforce the rule. And it is this remedy that gives the law meaning. We mentioned earlier about driving too fast. Well, if you drive 85 miles per hour in Texas and you are stopped by the police and you get a ticket, and that ticket is subject now to a fine, well, the fine is the means to enforce the rule. If we did not have the means to enforce the rule would essentially be meaningless. Now, what else? The law governs relationships. Essentially, that's what the law is doing. It's governing relationships. It governs relationships between the state and individuals. And when I say state, I mean society, community, city, state, federal government. It governs the relationship between that entity and individuals including things like businesses. Now, this is an area of the law that we call public law, and probably the best example of this type of law is criminal law. Criminal law is about violations against the state. When you commit a crime, when you commit a wrongful act, and that is in violation of a criminal statute, the real victim is not the person that was injured. The real victim is the state. If you've ever seen TV shows in which there is a criminal trial, you probably notice that they always refer to the case by the state of Texas versus John Smith, or the state of Louisiana versus Tiffany Thibodeau. In any event, the law is governing relationships between the state and the individuals. The victim of a crime is the state. It is society as a whole. We have all been hurt by that wrongful act. Now, the law also governs relationships between private individuals, and so we call this private law. So, public law is those relationships between the state and individuals, and private law is the relationship between individuals. Something like a contract. When you execute a contract with someone, that is a private agreement between yourself and the other party. However, that private agreement is still subject to the law. And so this is what the law is doing, is it's governing relationships. Now, what else does the law do? The law creates duties, obligations, and rights that reflect the accepted views of a given society. So once again, coming back to the idea that the law is the behavior that a community finds acceptable. The law represents a body of action or conduct that's prescribed by a controlling authority, state, city, federal government, and that has legal binding force. The law provides a mechanism to resolve disputes arising from duties and rights, and allows parties to enforce those duties and rights in a court of law. So the law provides a dispute resolution mechanism, which is what we will be addressing in the next lecture. The law can be set down in a written code, called a statute, or it can take the form of judicial decisions, which we would call common law, or actions of government agencies, which we refer to as administrative law. Now, what is the law doing? Why is the law important for business? Well, law contributes to a stable business environment. It establishes an order and, once again, defines acceptable behavior. The law is meant to promote fairness, equality, and justice, and the law provides a system for resolving disputes. The law further facilitates business transactions and good faith dealings between merchants. As I mentioned, the legal studies area has been focused on the notion that legal awareness can create the potential for competitive advantages. As one of the leading legal studies authors has commented, businesses operate in a sea of law, and legal awareness is therefore crucial for strategic decision making. Proactive legal strategies can limit liability, they can gain competitive advantage, and thereby create value for the business. Let's talk a bit about sources of the law. There are certain primary sources of the law, and I will go ahead and name these and we'll talk about each one in more detail, starting with constitutional law, statutory law, common law, and administrative law. Let's look at each of these in more detail, starting with constitutional law. Now, the constitutional law is the foundation for all other law in the United States. The Constitution is what authorizes the Congress to enact its law. So we could talk about the Constitution as the supreme law of the land. And how do we know it is the supreme law of the land? Because it says so in the Constitution. Now, what the Constitution does is it functions with other laws to first establish a structure for the federal and state governments and set rules for amending the Constitution. It will grant specific powers for the different branches of government. And finally, it provides procedural protections for U.S. citizens from wrongful government actions. The second primary source of the law is statutory law. Statutory law is the law created by a legislative body. So, for instance, the U.S. Congress is the exclusive legislative body for the passage of federal law. The Oklahoma State Legislature is the exclusive legislative body for the passage of Oklahoma law. A bill is a draft of a proposed statute, federal statute or state statute, that Congress or the legislature has not yet passed or that the executive has not yet approved, has not yet signed into law. Now, at the federal level, the president can sign a bill into law or veto it. And if the president vetoes the bill, Congress can override the veto with a 2/3 majority vote. Now, statutes at the local level, like the city of Stillwater, statutes at local levels are called ordinances. An ordinance generally regulates issues such as zoning, or they impose health and safety regulations. The next primary source of the law is the common law. Now, in the United States and in other systems of countries that were at one point subject to English control, we have a system called the common law. And common law is the law that is made by the courts, specifically appellate courts. And common law is based on a resolution of disputes between parties. When a court resolves a case, when an appellate court resolves a case, it will not only decide matters between the two parties involved in the case, but it also sets a standard, a specific standard for other courts to follow when a similar dispute arises again. So the common law created by courts is just as much the law as is other types of law, such as statutes or administrative law. Now, this process of providing a decision that will have guiding effect for other situations involving similarly situated individuals, we call that precedent. And precedent occurs when a court applies the law of a previous case to a current case with similar facts. And courts in our common law system are required to follow precedent when that precedent is issued by a superior court. So Oklahoma trial courts are required to follow the rules set by Oklahoma appellate courts. Oklahoma appellate courts are required to follow the decisions of the Oklahoma Supreme Court. And the Oklahoma Supreme Court is required to follow the decisions of the United States Supreme Court, all because of the rule of precedent. Finally, administrative law. Administrative law is the source of law that authorizes the exercise of authority by the executive branch agencies and by independent government agencies. Often when a legislative body, such as the U.S. Congress, passes a law, they do so in a very vague sort of way, a sort of ambiguous way. And we leave it up to executive agencies to tell us what the law meant. Now, federal administrative law is largely authorized by statutes and the Constitution, and the rules for applying the law are articulated and carried out by administrative agencies. Administrative agencies are empowered to administer the details of federal statutes, and they have broad powers to impose regulations, to make policy, and to enforce the law in their designated area of jurisdiction. So, in conclusion, what did we learn today? Understanding legal foundations is essential for business success. Law and strategy are intertwined in the modern business landscape. And finally, working collaboratively with your legal counsel can help to mitigate risks and maximize opportunities. That's all for this one. Thanks a lot. If you have any questions, please let me know. Otherwise, I will see you in the next lecture.